All right, my friend. Let's talk about common sense. You ever met someone who just doesn't get it? Like they stare at a push sign on a door and keep pulling, or they microwave a metal spoon and wonder why sparks fly. Maybe they drive their car into a flooded road thinking, hey, it doesn't look that deep, and next thing you know, they're calling a tow truck. We all know someone like this. And honestly, it can be frustrating, funny, or downright dangerous depending on the situation. But what's really going on when someone lacks common sense? Is it about intelligence? Is it something they can fix? Or are they just doomed to a life of making obvious mistakes? That's what we're diving into today. See, common sense isn't just about avoiding dumb mistakes. It's the foundation of how we understand the world. It's what tells us that if you drop your phone, gravity is going to take over. It's what makes us believe the world around us is real without needing a 10-page philosophical argument. Think about it. If someone walked up to you and said, hey, are you sure your hands are real? What if they're an illusion? You'd probably laugh. Or if they were serious, you'd slowly back away. That's because your brain is wired to accept certain truths without question. Like the fact that you exist, the sun rises in the morning, and eating expired sushi is a terrible idea. Philosophers like Thomas Reid and G.E. Moore built their ideas around this kind of thinking. They argued that some things are so obviously true that doubting them is pointless. And when people start questioning basic facts, like whether the world is real or if they actually have a body, that's when we start running into trouble. So, my friend, let's break this down. What exactly is common sense? And why does it matter so much? All right, my friend, let's break it down. What exactly is common sense? Most people think of it as just basic, everyday logic, like knowing not to put your hand on a hot stove or understanding that walking barefoot on Legos is a terrible idea. But in philosophy, common sense goes deeper. It's not just about avoiding bad decisions. It's about how we know things without needing proof. Enter Thomas Reid, an 18th century Scottish philosopher. He believed that common sense is the foundation of human knowledge. According to him, there are certain truths we all just know instinctively. Truths that don't need endless debate or evidence. For example, the world exists, and it's not just a dream. Other people are real, not just figments of your imagination. If you let go of an object, it'll fall. Thanks, gravity. Reid's point was simple. If we start questioning everything, we won't get anywhere. Imagine someone refusing to believe in food unless they could personally verify every ingredient down to the molecular level. They'd starve before they were satisfied. At some point, you have to take things at face value. Now let's fast forward to G.E. Moore, a British philosopher from the early 1900s. He had a famous argument against skepticism, which is basically the habit of questioning everything. One day, he stood in front of a room full of philosophers, held up his hands and said, here is one hand, here is another. Therefore, hands exist. Simple, right? But that was his whole point. Moore believed some things are so obvious that questioning them is absurd. If someone demands proof that their hands exist, they're overthinking life to a dangerous degree. Common sense is what keeps us grounded. It's what stops us from falling into a rabbit hole of doubt where nothing is real, and every little fact needs an argument. Without it, people can end up questioning reality itself. And that's where things get weird. Now let's see what happens when someone doesn't have common sense. All right, my friend, here's where things get interesting. What actually happens when someone doesn't have common sense? Well, it's not just about making dumb mistakes. It's about struggling with the basic truths that the rest of us take for granted. Let's start with everyday situations. We've all seen people who ignore warning signs because they know better. Like the guy who climbs over a do not enter fence at a zoo because he wants a closer look at the lions. Or the person who believes they can drive on an empty gas tank for just a few more miles, and then get stranded in the middle of nowhere. This isn't always about intelligence. A person can be brilliant in one area, say a scientist or an engineer, but still lack the ability to make basic, practical decisions. They might overcomplicate simple things or ignore obvious risks. Why? Because they're not relying on common sense. They're stuck in their own way of thinking. Now, let's take it a step further. What happens when someone starts questioning the wrong things? Imagine someone saying, how do I really know my house won't just disappear overnight? Or, what if gravity stops working tomorrow? If you spend too much time doubting everything, you end up in a mental loop where nothing feels real. That's how some extreme skeptics think. Instead of accepting basic truths, like Moore's example that, yes, your hands do exist, they demand absolute proof for things that don't need it. They fall into what I'd call paralysis by analysis. They question reality so much that they stop functioning in it. And then there are the conspiracy theorists, the ones who refuse to believe anything unless they personally witness it. The moon landing? Fake? Airplanes? Just birds in disguise? Gravity? A hoax by big science. They take skepticism to a whole new level, rejecting even the most basic truths because they think they're being tricked. At best, lacking common sense just makes life harder. More mistakes, more frustration, more unnecessary risks. At worst, it can disconnect someone from reality entirely. And that, my friend, is where things get dangerous. So let's talk about skepticism next. When questioning things goes too far. All right, my friend, let's talk about what happens when skepticism runs wild. It's one thing to be curious and ask questions. That's normal. But when someone doubts everything, even obvious truths, they start heading down a path that leads to nowhere. Think about this. Imagine you're at a coffee shop and your friend suddenly says, "How do you know this table is real? What if it's just an illusion?" You'd probably laugh it off at first, but what if they kept going? What if the coffee isn't real? What if I'm not real? What if nothing is real? At some point, you'd have to stop them and say, "All right, man, drink your coffee and relax." This is exactly the kind of extreme skepticism that Thomas Reid and G.E. Moore warned about. Reid argued that some truths are self-evident, meaning they don't need proof because doubting them is pointless. Moore made it even simpler by holding up his hands and saying, "Here's one hand, here's another. Hands exist, done." But some people just can't accept that. They think if something can be questioned, it must be questioned. And that leads to absurd conclusions. Take extreme skeptics who refuse to believe the world exists unless they have absolute proof. Problem? You can't live like that. You can't stop and question the reality of the ground every time you take a step. You'd never get anywhere. Then there are the conspiracy thinkers who demand proof for everything but reject any evidence that doesn't fit their belief. Photos of Earth from space? Fake. Scientists proving gravity? Liars, medical research, a cover-up? They refuse to accept facts not because they've found better information, but because they've decided that nothing can be trusted. This level of doubt isn't smart. It's exhausting. Imagine questioning every meal you eat, every road you drive on, and every piece of furniture you sit on. You'd go crazy. That's why common sense acts as a shortcut, saving us from overthinking everything. At some point, you have to accept that some things are just true. Otherwise, you stop making sense, and the world becomes a confusing, unlivable mess. So, my friend, let's get real. How do we balance healthy questioning with common sense? And how can we make sure we don't fall into the trap of doubting reality itself? Let's break it down. All right, my friend, let's bring this down to earth. We've talked about what happens when people lack common sense and when skepticism goes too far. But how do we see this play out in real life? How does common sense help us navigate the world without getting lost in endless questions? Let's start with something simple. Crossing the street. You don't stop and ask, is this car real? Is motion even a thing? No, you look both ways, trust your eyes, and move when it's safe. That's common sense at work. You're not overthinking it. You're relying on instincts and basic truths to keep yourself alive. Now let's flip it. Imagine someone who refuses to trust their senses. They won't cross the street because what if their eyes are lying? They won't eat food because what if it's poisoned? They won't talk to people because what if everyone is secretly a robot? You see where this is going. Without common sense, even basic tasks become impossible. This is why Thomas Reid argued that common sense is the foundation of knowledge. It's not just about convenience, it's what allows us to function. If we had to prove every single thing we believed, we'd never get anything done. At some point, we have to trust that what we see, hear, and experience is real. And that's where G.E. Moore's argument comes in. When he held up his hands and said, "Here is one hand, here is another. Hands exist." He wasn't being lazy, he was making a point. Some things are so obvious that questioning them is ridiculous. You don't need a philosophy degree to know you have hands, you just know. Now, let's take a modern example. The internet. You've probably met someone who refuses to believe any news, no matter how well documented it is. To them, everything is fake. The problem? If you think everything is a lie, you can't function. You end up either believing whatever suits your personal bias or rejecting reality entirely. Neither is a great way to live. Common sense keeps us from falling into that trap. It's the balance between reasonable skepticism and pointless skepticism. Questioning things is good, it's how we learn. But questioning everything, that's how you lose touch with reality. So, how do we sharpen our common sense and avoid falling into the extremes of blind trust or endless doubt? Let's wrap this up with some final thoughts. All right, my friend, let's cut through the noise. We've seen what happens when people lack common sense, when they question everything, and when skepticism spirals out of control. So, how do we stay grounded? How do we balance curiosity with practicality? First, let's get one thing straight. Common sense isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing when to stop questioning and just accept basic truths. You don't need to prove that the sky is blue or that your feet are touching the ground. You just go with it. That's the shortcut common sense gives us. It helps us move through life without getting stuck in an endless loop of doubt. Now, some people confuse common sense with gut feelings. Not the same thing. A gut feeling is that little voice that says, something feels off. Common sense, on the other hand, is about recognizing obvious facts. Like if a scammer calls you saying you want a free vacation, common sense tells you, yeah, right. It's not just a feeling, it's logic based on experience. So, how do you sharpen your common sense? Here are a few ways. Learn from mistakes, yours and others. If you see someone microwave aluminum foil and nearly start a fire, you don't need to test it yourself. Common sense says, yep, that's a bad idea. The smartest people learn from experience, especially from watching others mess up. Think before acting, but don't overthink. If you're about to make a major decision, pause and ask, what's the most obvious outcome? 9 times out of 10, the simplest answer is the right one. Don't get lost in unnecessary complications. Don't ignore reality in favor of wild theories. There's questioning things, and then there's rejecting reality just because it doesn't fit your ideas. If you need 10 layers of explanation to deny something simple, you're probably overthinking it. Trust basic truths. Some things don't need proof. If someone asks you to prove you exist, don't waste time debating it. Just live your life. Thomas Reid and G.E. Moore were right. Common sense is what keeps us from falling into mental chaos. At the end of the day, common sense is what makes life livable. Without it, we'd be stuck questioning everything, never making a decision, and possibly walking straight into danger. The trick is to know when to question things and when to just go with what's obvious. So, my friend, let's wrap this up with one final thought. Why does all of this matter? And what's the biggest takeaway from this whole discussion? Let's bring it home. All right, my friend, here's where we bring it all together. We've talked about what common sense is, what happens when people lack it, and how skepticism can go too far. But why does all of this really matter? Why should you care? Simple. Because common sense is what keeps us sane. In today's world, we're drowning in information. Social media, news, influencers, conspiracy theories, expert opinions. Everywhere you turn, someone's trying to convince you of something. Some of it's true, some of it's nonsense, and a lot of it is designed to make you doubt things that should be obvious. That's why common sense is more important than ever. It helps you cut through the noise. It's the built-in filter that says, wait a second, does this actually make sense? Without it, you're at the mercy of every wild idea that comes your way. Think about it. Every major mistake in history happened because people ignored common sense. Financial bubbles? People ignored obvious risks and thought the market would never crash. Bad leaders? People trusted empty promises instead of asking, does this person actually know what they're doing? Scams? People let greed override their basic instincts and got tricked by deals that were too good to be true. At the same time, we can't fall into the trap of questioning everything to the point where nothing seems real. If you doubt every piece of evidence, dismiss every expert, and refuse to accept even the most basic facts, you're just as lost as someone who believes everything they're told. So here's the real takeaway. Common sense is about balance. It's knowing when to trust the facts, when to ask questions, and when to just move on. It's what allows us to function without second-guessing every little thing. And the good news? You can sharpen it. Pay attention to reality. Learn from experience. Trust what makes sense. And most importantly, don't let overthinking ruin your ability to live in the real world. At the end of the day, common sense is what keeps us grounded, keeps us safe, and keeps us moving forward. It's not just a nice thing to have, it's a survival skill. So, my friend, next time you see someone pulling on a door that says push, take a moment to appreciate your own common sense. And maybe, just maybe, give them a little nudge in the right direction.